Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, September 26th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, the first delivery of Abrams tanks to Ukraine. So Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Monday that the first batch of US-made Abrams tanks have arrived in Ukraine, and these tanks are armed with toxic depleted uranium ammunition. So Zelensky wrote on X, quote, "Abrams are already in Ukraine and are preparing to reinforce our brigades. I am grateful to our allies for fulfilling the agreements. We are looking for new contracts and expanding the geography of supply," end quote. Always looking for more. So U.S. officials confirmed the arrival in comments to the New York Times. They said they were the first of 31 tanks that Ukraine would receive and that more would be delivered in the coming months. These officials said that so far Ukraine has received 2 tank platoons, and according to the New York Times, that puts the number somewhere between 8 and 10 that's already arrived. So the U.S. is supplying Ukraine with refurbished M1A1 Abrams, which is an older variant of the tank. When the Biden administration first announced that it would arm Ukraine with Abrams, they promised new M1A2 tanks, but they needed to be manufactured and would have taken years to be delivered. So the Pentagon chose to send older tanks to speed up the timeline. I believe it was January this year, or sometime around then, that the U.S. first announced they were going to send Abrams. And this is another thing that at first, the U.S., the Pentagon was saying, no, we're not going to send Abrams tanks. They're not practical. They're too hard to maintain. But the U.S. was pressured by Germany sending the Leopard tanks and all that. Or actually, what they said, they had to promise Abrams tanks for Ukraine to get Germany to sign off on the Leopard tank deliveries. So this, of course, marks a significant escalation of U.S. support for the war. Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, he previously ruled out sending tanks. He ultimately agreed to send the Leopard's tanks. But, his reasoning for it at the time when he was against sending tanks, sending warplanes, was that he was trying to avoid World War III. But now they continue to climb this escalation ladder. And, another significant escalation in the U.S. support here is the fact that they're arming Ukraine with depleted uranium, with DU, which is a byproduct of enriched uranium. It's slightly radioactive, and it's linked to cancer and birth defects where it is used, especially in Iraq, where the U.S. used a whole lot of it. And the Pentagon announced that it was shipping 120 millimeter DU rounds to Ukraine as part of a weapons package that was announced on September 6th. And they said that was for use with the Abrams tanks. So the U.S. is not the first NATO country to arm Ukraine with DU. That was actually the UK. They first did it earlier this year for use with the British-made Challenger 2 tanks. And in response to the British doing that, President Putin ordered the deployment of nukes to Belarus. When he said he was going to send tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus, he said it was in response to the UK arming Ukraine with depleted uranium. It was for other reasons as well, but the fact that he said that shows how Russia views this. They view this as a huge escalation. Russian officials said that they would treat the use of DU as the same as the use of a dirty bomb, but the British still decided to send it, and now the U.S. Has sent it as well. All right, so the next one here, Ukraine claims that it killed Russia's Black Sea commander. So a pretty serious claim here from Ukraine. They're saying that an attack that was launched on the Crimean Peninsula on Friday killed 34 Russian officers, including the head of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, Admiral Viktor Sokolov. So this Ukrainian claim is not confirmed, and the Russian side only reported that one serviceman was missing after the strike, so we don't really know exactly what happened here. But this strike did target the Russian Black Sea Fleet's headquarters in Sevastopol, Crimea. Ukrainian sources told media outlets that the strike was launched with British-provided Storm Shadow missiles, which have a range of about 155 miles. So on Monday, Ukraine's Special Operations Forces said, quote, after the defeat of the headquarters of the Russian armed forces, 34 officers died, including the commander of the Russian armed forces. Another 105 occupiers were wounded. The headquarters building cannot be restored, end quote. So they're referring there to the Black Sea Fleet headquarters. They say Russian armed forces, but that's the translation. So Kirilo Budanov, who is the head of Ukraine's military intelligence, he initially claimed that this strike killed 9 people and wounded 16. The Ukrainian military said that the strike was timed to target a meeting of Russian naval officers. But again, Russia has not confirmed that any officers were killed. They haven't said anybody was killed in this strike. They just said somebody was missing. So Ukraine has significantly stepped up its attacks on Crimea in recent weeks amid its faltering counteroffensive. The Friday attack came as Zelensky was visiting Canada's parliament, where he went right after visiting Washington. And it was that day that he joined the Canadian Parliament in a standing ovation for a Ukrainian World War II veteran who actually fought on the Nazi side. So that, caused a lot of international outcry, forcing the Canadian politicians who were responsible to apologize. They're getting a lot of heat for that little incident. So, of course, as I'm always going on about, Ukrainian attacks inside Crimea risk a very big escalation of the war. You never know how Russia might respond to this, especially attacks using NATO weapons, and they're using these Storm Shadow missiles to hit Crimea. So if this Ukrainian claim is true, which again we don't know, it seems like there's no way to know what the story is right now. It's a big claim that they killed a top-level Russian military official with NATO missiles. So, one day is Russia going to decide to respond to these types of attacks by attacking NATO? Right now, luckily, there's no sign that Putin wants a war with NATO, but you don't know how far things are going to go here. And again, I mentioned earlier that this is, as the counteroffensive is pretty clearly, a failure. These attacks inside Crimea, drone attacks inside the Russian mainland have really stepped up. And I think it's kind of an effort by Ukraine to try to inflict some damage, or at least look like they're inflicting some damage on the Russians to keep the support going for them. All right, so the next one here, the Biden administration is not pushing Ukraine to hold elections. So a senior U.S. official told the Washington Post that the Biden administration is not pressuring Ukraine to hold elections, while some Western officials do want to see a wartime vote. So an unnamed U.S. official told the Post, quote, "We're not pushing them to have an election," end quote. The report said that the Biden administration was sympathetic to the logistical obstacles to holding a vote, which includes the fact that millions of Ukrainian refugees are in Europe. The administration's position runs counter to its rhetoric about the war, which it has framed as a battle for democracy. So Ukraine's constitution prohibits elections during martial law, but Zelensky has expressed an openness to holding elections if the U.S. and its allies pay for it. He said that after Lindsey Graham, Richard Blumenthal, and Elizabeth Warren visited Kyiv. According to the Washington Post, the 3 senators pressed Zelensky on holding elections, and after that he said, again, Zelensky basically said, we might be able to do it if you pay for it, because I'm not diverting any money from the military, from the weapons. So if you can cough up the money, maybe we'll have elections. But I think if the Biden administration isn't pushing for it, it's not going to happen. And the Washington Post report was basically on, the administration's side, saying that, it would be so difficult to hold elections. It's impossible. They quoted former Ukrainian Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko, and she said that Ukraine would lose the war if elections were held. She said, quote, "The price of holding elections in wartime will be a lost war. Unity is an indispensable resource for our victory," end quote. And I thought that was interesting because the precedent for holding a wartime election is the American Civil War. There was the U.S. presidential elections in 1864, and Lincoln's opponent, George B. McClellan, wanted peace. He was Lincoln's former general, but he wanted to end the war, and reach a deal with the Confederacy to do that, and they still held elections. But so right now, I don't know if there would really be opposition to Zelensky, that would want to end the war, if that's a strong enough political force inside Ukraine. Based on the polls, it looks like Zelensky has a lot of support for the people that are still in Ukraine. And Zelensky's basically saying that he would want the U.S. to pay for making sure the millions of refugees in Europe, which is, I think, 7 million Ukrainian refugees that are in Europe, could also vote. So it's not clear what they think about this because they're not being polled, or at least I assume they're not. But martial law has been extended until November 15th, which pushed back Ukraine's parliamentary elections scheduled for October. Martial law will be extended as long as there is a war, and there's no sign that the conflict is going to be over by when the presidential elections are scheduled, which is March 2024. So Ukraine's martial law prohibits men aged 18 to 60 from leaving the country, and in March 2022, Zelensky used his martial law powers to ban 11 opposition parties and nationalize the TV media. So if there is a vote, how fair will it be? All right, so the next one here, U.S. taxpayer dollars are subsidizing small businesses in Ukraine. So a report from 60 Minutes that aired on Sunday detailed how U.S. taxpayer dollars are not only funding weapons in Ukraine, but are also subsidizing small businesses and paying first responder salaries, among other things. While the bulk of U.S. support for Ukraine has gone toward military aid, the U.S. has also provided tens of billions of dollars in a form of assistance known as direct budgetary aid. According to the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, the budgetary aid keeps basic government services like hospitals, schools, and utilities running. It sustains support for emergency responders and firefighters. According to the 60 Minutes report, the U.S. aid pays for the salaries of all 57,000 of Ukraine's first responders. And 60 Minutes spoke with a woman who runs a knitting business in Ukraine, and she said that she is receiving subsidies from the U.S. taxpayer. So knitwear, there's a picture of her with a blanket or something and things like that she makes, getting subsidized by U.S. taxpayer dollars. She told 60 Minutes, quote, "We realize that it's the aid from government, but it's the aid from the heart of every ordinary American person," end quote. So U.S. officials working for USAID helped her business find new customers overseas, and other examples of non-military aid include the U.S. purchasing seeds and fertilizers for Ukrainian farmers. The 60 Minutes report said that the U.S. has pumped $25 billion in non-military aid into Ukraine. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. announces a $2 billion loan for Poland. So the Biden administration on Monday announced a $2 billion loan for Poland that will go toward modernizing Warsaw's military. The State Department said in a press release, quote, "Today the United States is proud to announce the signing of a milestone $2 billion foreign military financing direct loan agreement to support Poland's defense modernization," end quote. The State Department said that the U.S. would also provide $60 million to cover the cost of the loan. The press release described Warsaw as a stalwart U.S. ally as Poland has become a major hub for arms shipments to Ukraine to spend more on its military than most European NATO members. The State Department said, quote, "In addition to its central support role in facilitating international assistance to neighboring Ukraine, Poland has demonstrated its ironclad commitment to strengthening regional security through its robust investments in defense spending," end quote. So they're happy Poland is spending a lot. The reason why they're happy is because Poland has been unloading their old Soviet-made equipment into Ukraine, and they're purchasing lots of U.S. and other NATO military equipment, which is a boon for Western arms makers. The U.S. has also significantly expanded its military presence in Poland since Russia invaded Ukraine. There's currently about 10,000 U.S. troops stationed in Poland. And it's interesting timing with this loan announcement because it comes after Poland's prime minister said that Poland would no longer provide arms to Ukraine amid this spat between Ukraine and Poland over the import of Ukrainian grain into Poland, which Poland has banned. And that marked a pretty significant shift since Poland has been a staunch backer of the proxy war against Russia. U.S. officials and Western media outlets have attempted to downplay the spat, insisting that it's part of Polish election rhetoric and that it would not impact NATO support for Ukraine. Poland's parliamentary elections are scheduled for October 15th, and the ruling Law and Justice Party has come under domestic criticism for being subservient to Ukraine. So they're saying, don't worry about it. It's just election talk. It's not going to impact things. But I still think, it could mean, that NATO is starting to fracture over the support for Ukraine. Speaking of which, the next one here, Hungary threatens to pull support from Ukraine. This article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. Now, Hungary is different than Poland. Viktor Orban has been pretty outspoken against the policy of fueling this proxy war. Prime Minister Viktor Orban said that Budapest was ending support for Kyiv on international issues due to a 2017 Ukrainian law that limits the rights of Hungarians. The announcement comes as Ukraine's support in Eastern Europe wanes. Kyle mentions the situation with Poland. So speaking to the country's legislature on Monday, Orban took aim at a 2017 Ukrainian law that limits where the Hungarian language can be spoken. He said, quote, "They want to transform Hungarian schools into Ukrainian schools, and if that does not work, they want to close them. We do not support Ukraine in any issue in the international scene until it restores the laws that guarantee the rights of Hungarians," end quote. So there's an ethnic Hungarian population inside Ukraine, and that's what he's talking about. And after the U.S.-backed coup in Kyiv in 2014, a nationalist Ukrainian government came to power, and they adopted a series of laws attempting to eliminate Russian culture in Ukraine. And this is interesting. I didn't know about this law that limits Hungarian language as well. That was in 2017, again, that Orban said. So it's interesting. And, when it comes to Hungary, they're an EU country, so they are part of the EU assistance to Ukraine. I'm not sure exactly what kind of material support Hungary has actually provided Ukraine, if it's really anything significant. But, Orban's always been kind of an outlier. All right. And they don't like him for it. All right, so the next one here, another one from Kyle. The U.S. deploys F-16s to Romania for patrols over the Black Sea. So 4 American advanced fighter jets arrived in Romania and will begin conducting patrols over the Black Sea region, according to NATO. The deployment comes as Washington wages a proxy war against Moscow in Ukraine that has stretched into the Black Sea. NATO spokesman Dylan White announced the arrival of F-16s on Friday, saying, quote, "I welcome the United States' deployment of additional F-16 fighter jets to NATO's air policing mission in Romania. This sends a clear message that we will protect every ally. As Russia continues its brutal war of aggression against Ukraine, we have seen a number of strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure very close to NATO territory. We remain vigilant and in close contact with allies in the region," end quote. Last week, Romania extended a no-fly zone around its eastern border. Bucharest said that the restriction extends to 20 to 30 kilometers inside Romanian territory, and that's as the fighting has expanded in Ukraine, with Russia bombing Ukraine's Danube River ports, and that river acts as a border between Ukraine and Romania. But here we have more U.S. military assets in the region. And, with these patrols over the Black Sea, it's always been a risk. Well before the war, the U.S. and NATO were sending a ton of planes, were sailing a lot of ships in the Black Sea. And it's just always a risk of some sort of incident happening with Russia, because their aircraft do have encounters, or, tense encounters over the Black Sea. As we know, because there was that one incident where an MQ-9 Reaper drone was actually downed after encountering some Russian planes. All right, so the next one here, President Biden hosts Pacific Island leaders as part of his strategy against China. So President Biden is hosting Pacific Island leaders for a second annual summit in Washington. That's part of his administration's strategy to counter China in the Asia-Pacific. All of a sudden, the U.S. really cares about very small Pacific Island nations. So the 2-day U.S. Pacific Islands Summit Forum kicked off on Monday and started with President Biden announcing that the U.S. would recognize and establish diplomatic relations with two small island nations. So one is the Cook Islands, and the other is Niue, which I might be pronouncing wrong. I meant to double check how to pronounce that. It's spelled Niue. So Niue is a small island with a population of just over 1,600, and the Cook Islands is comprised of 15 islands and has a population of around 15,000. In a statement on the recognition, President Biden noted that the U.S. military built runways on the Cook Islands during World War II. So there's an implication there that the U.S. might be looking to establish some kind of military presence there. President Biden said that establishing relations with both nations will help advance a free and open Indo-Pacific, a term that U.S. officials use when discussing efforts against China in the region. The U.S. has been working on expanding its military presence in the Pacific to prepare for a future war with China, which includes an agreement signed earlier this year with Papua New Guinea. And that grants the U.S. access to the country's airports and seaports. The U.S. is also expanding its military presence in Australia and extending agreements to maintain military access to the Marshall Islands, Palau, and Micronesia. U.S. Pacific Air Forces Commander General Kenneth Wilsbach recently said, and he said this a few times, that the purpose of this expansion is to give China more areas that it will need to target in a future war. And I hope these countries are listening when he says that, because that's exactly what they're becoming. If they allow the U.S. military to come in, they're going to become targets in a future war. So this summit, again, it started Monday. It's going to be held on Tuesday as well. It's being attended by representatives from 18 Pacific nations. And this is the second annual one of these summits that the U.S. has done. The U.S. is opening new embassies in the region, and this is all part of what they call the Indo-Pacific strategy that China views as a containment, Cold War style containment strategy. And it's hard to, disagree with their, the way they look at it. From their viewpoint, that's exactly what the U.S. is doing, is trying to encircle and contain China. All right, so the next one here, Menendez refuses to resign, slams indictment as salacious. So this is another article from Kyle, and it is about Senator Bob Menendez and his corruption indictment. He denied the allegations levied against him on Monday, and he says that he's going to fight this indictment, and he's been accused of bribery charges, and investigators found hundreds of thousands of dollars in his house, I believe about $500,000 in cash and gold bars. And they say it's bribes that he received. He's accused of receiving bribes to benefit 3 local businessmen and the Egyptian government. Essentially, the big accusation is him taking money from the Egyptian government through some people, but doing that and in exchange pushing through arms sales for Egypt, because he has a lot of power in that as the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Although he stepped down from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but he's not resigning as a senator, and he has denied the allegations. He said, quote, "The allegations leveled against me are just that, allegations. I recognize that this will be the biggest fight yet. Not only will I be exonerated, I will still be New Jersey's senior senator," end quote. So which interesting. He also suggested he was being targeted because he's Latino. He said at one point, quote, "It is not lost on me how quickly some are rushing to judge a Latino and push him out of his seat," end quote. And what's interesting, he's trying to explain away all this money, which is over $500,000, Kyle says here, in his house. He's saying that he just withdrew the money from a savings account. He said, quote, "This may seem old-fashioned, but these were monies drawn from my personal savings account based on the income that I have lawfully derived over those 30 years, end quote. And he accused the prosecutors of being as salacious as possible. All right, so the next one here, the last story, the U.S. has failed to compensate Iraqi victims of torture. This article is from Middle East Eye. So the United States government has failed to compensate the Iraqi victims of torture at Abu Ghraib and other U.S.-run prisons in Iraq, Human Rights Watch said in a new report on Monday. So HRW said in its report that it reached out to the Pentagon in June requesting information regarding compensation for torture survivors in Iraq, and it received no response. So the George W. Bush administration told Congress back then that any Iraqis who suffered grievous and brutal abuse, cruelty at the hands of a few members of the United States Armed Forces would be eligible for compensation. However, that never happened, according to this report. HRW's Washington director said, quote, 20 years on, Iraqis who were tortured by U.S. personnel still have no clear path for filing a claim or receiving any kind of redress or recognition from the U.S. government. U.S. officials have indicated that they prefer to leave torture in the past, but the long-term effects of torture are still a daily reality for many Iraqis and their families, end quote. So that is it for the news for today. Go check out our Viewpoints, one from Ted Galen Carpenter. One Western official finally comes clean about NATO expansion, talking about what Stoltenberg had to say recently. One from Edward Hunt, the U.S. flouts international law with Pacific military claims. So this is an interesting article. The U.S., this is discussing the Marshall Islands, Palau, and the Federated States of Micronesia, who the U.S. has these compact of free association agreements with them. Basically, the U.S. provides them aid, and in exchange, the U.S. gets military access to these islands. And they also say that they can deny other countries military access to the islands. And this article from Edward Hunt is very interesting. It was originally at Responsible Statecraft, and we're reprinting it at antiwar.com. It just mentions how the U.S. is claiming they can control these island nations' exclusive economic zone, which extends, I believe, 200 nautical miles from their coast under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the UNCLOS Treaty. And the thing is about UNCLOS is that that's not what an exclusive economic zone is. You don't have that right to control who comes and goes from that area. That the exclusive economic zone gives the country the rights to the resources in that area, as long as it doesn't overlap with another country's territorial waters or something like that. And territorial waters, they say that they could deny other countries' militaries from entering, but that only extends 12 miles from their coast. And what's interesting about it is that the U.S. rejects China's claims to the South China Sea under the UNCLOS Treaty using all their definitions, even though, what's interesting, the U.S. actually is not a party to the treaty. So it's just an example of the U.S. using international law when it benefits them in rejecting China's claims to the South China Sea, and then, forgetting about it when it comes to their control of this huge swath of the Pacific. The Micronesia, Marshall Islands, and Palau is an area about the size of the continental United States out there in the Pacific Ocean. All right, so the next viewpoint, one from Mark Espikopoulos. The U.S. is the U.S. punishing Turkey for its neutral stance on Ukraine war? One from Ryan McMacken. Armed neutrality is the only moral foreign policy. And one from Norman Solomon for our spotlight. For the New York Times, cluster bombs are wrong when Russia uses them. So go check all that out. And that is it for me. You could always help us out by sharing the show on social media, liking, subscribing, commenting, telling your friends about antiwar.com. Follow us on Twitter, share our stuff there. But that's it for me for today. I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.